The Temple Mount podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my good friend MJP. And today's topic is going to be Christianity and common sense. Are they one and the same? Are they different? We'll get into it in a minute. Make sure you've joined us on the Temple Mount Discord server and followed us on YouTube and BitChute for our podcast channel. That being said, welcome MJP. How are you today, my friend?
How's it going, Shogun?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, you described the subject as Christianity and common sense. Where do you want to kind of bring us into this?
So I think that this is a really traditional topic that a lot of people believe is supposed to make sense, but they don't really know how to put the two topics together. So that's what I want to do here. I want to put the two topics together by, tying some aspects of what we find in Scripture to some things that we found in history, and how Jesus, refers to common sense, and how this deals with Paul's evangelization of the Greeks, as well as the Greeks' exposure to Abrahamic tradition and what they did with it. So what a lot of people don't understand is the Greeks were actually exposed to Abrahamic tradition back in the 4th century BC, and we have records of this going back to Clearchus of Soli, in which he discusses how Abrahamic tradition interacted with Aristotle. And I have an article that we can link along with a few other articles in the YouTube video and whatnot, so people can look at this stuff for themselves. But basically what happens in the 4th century is, after Aristotle is exposed to Abrahamic tradition and after Aristotle passes away, the Greeks found 3 schools of thought called the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Pyrrhonists. And these guys end up coming up with a few ideas that are later consolidated in what is called in Latin sensus communis. The Greek phrases that are united are called koinos thesis, koin nous, and koin enoia. A thesis deals with the idea that regardless of sensation, there are sensibilities at stake. Nous deals with the idea that we all have certain mentalities that we can use in order to appreciate these sensibilities. And then enoia is that we all have common ideas after the fact of using those mentalities. So we have things like our sense of humor, our sense of taste, our sense of justice, our sense of balance, etc. So what's interesting about all this is a couple centuries after the Greeks are exposed to Abrahamic tradition, there's something called the Maccabean Revolt. And this becomes a point of contention among not just Christians, but Christians and Jews, because it's recorded in the books of Maccabees, which may or may not be treated as canon. And this especially applies to 4th Maccabees, which isn't even treated as canon by Catholics or Eastern Orthodox. It's only recognized as canon by the Georgian Orthodox Church. But what's really interesting about 4th Maccabees, and I can give a link to this too if people want to read up on this, is it deals with the contemplations of the Stoics and the others after the fact that they're exposed to Abrahamic tradition. But in any case, the concern at stake in the Maccabean Revolt is the Hebrews don't want to be Hellenized. They don't want to have to convert to Greek ways of life. And there's a few excuses taken for this, which I want to address because none of them are really valid. The first one is they're concerned about imperialism because of Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire that was divided. You have the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, who are both jockeying for control, but it's not clear that either of them would be able to garnish control, especially because of the fact that the Israelites had signed a previous treaty of friendship with the Romans after the fact that they had engaged in conflict with the Seleucids themselves. So the Israelites seemed like they were rather sovereign and they were going to be able to remain intact. The second thing is they were concerned about pederasty, which is the practice of mentor-student relationships taking a romantic turn. But Plato, at the end of his last writing, The Laws, explicitly condemns pederasty. So it's clear that that's not really being practiced by the Greeks either anymore. And the third one is they're concerned that the Greeks are going to be expanding, polytheism. But it's clear that after Abrahamic tradition was exposed to Aristotle, that the Stoics, Epicureans, and Pyrrhonists all rejected the notion of polytheism once and for all, and that they had embraced the idea of a monotheistic creator who was omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient.
Okay, I would like to see sources on that one because
No,
that
you gotta hold up, dude. We're not doing question and answers yet. We're gonna do a presentation.
Okay, how does one present the ideal that Aristotle became a pure Christian when it's very well known that he was in no shape or form anything like?
You gotta finish his presentation before we start the question and answer.
Yes, the way the podcasts work is that the guest talks about things, and after things are ironed out, that's when we have the back and forth.
Yeah. So we'll do an AMA afterwards. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, the notion of polytheism isn't really a valid concern. What is a concern at stake is that the Jews have a way of looking upon things that is very narrative based. It's not categorically based. And this is something that carries on when Paul is sent to the Greeks in order to evangelize the Greeks. And he tells the Greeks that they don't have to uphold the old Mosaic ways. We're all familiar with, for example, the story in Ephesians that deals with circumcision and the matter of circumcision of flesh and circumcision of spirit and how all that plays out. The concern about Paul is he's actually called to service because the Greeks themselves are requesting assistance. I had this found in scripture. Yeah, so in Acts 6, chapter 6, it talks about how the Greeks are looking for assistance because it's established by that time that the faithful will be helping each other out in how they live communally. And after that, Stephen, one of the disciples, he ends up becoming a martyr, and Paul, while he is Saul, is recognized as a persecutor. And then we all know about the story that happens in the following chapters of how he falls down and how he sees Jesus and how he changes his ways, and then how he gets into arguments with his fellow Pharisees and with the Greeks themselves, and how eventually, as a consequence of this, he realizes that in order to really repent, he goes to Greece in order to, reconcile and make amends. This all follows as well from how Jesus is approached by the Greeks, which we know in John. Let me see if I can find it again. I think it's chapter 20 when the Greeks approach. Or maybe I got the wrong section here. Give me a second. Oh, okay. I'll have to come back to that. But the point is, there's a time when the Greeks end up approaching Jesus and they want to hear his story, and Jesus very deliberately turns them down because he wants to make sure that they don't go down with him via guilt by association. He's going to be crucified, and he knows how the mob and the academics and how the authorities can be cynical and who they associate with him. So he wants to make sure that they remain intact. And we also know about Jesus' own sense of common sense, which connects with the Greeks, because Jesus has this thing that we all know called the greatest commandment, which is the idea that you're supposed to love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Some people interpret those last two as strength and understanding. And you're supposed to love your neighbors as though you love yourself. So it's clear that Jesus does not want us to play favorites in who we recognize as deserving of grace, but rather we're supposed to recognize gracefulness as applying to everyone out there. So what we see with Paul is that he is taking this message, which is already being appreciated by the Greeks, and he's telling the Greeks, hey, you guys have a good idea, actually implement it into your faith and make it so that way you don't have to simply abide by a specific narrative, which is what was going on during the Maccabean revolt with the Israelites and how they simply wanted to have their own specific narrative. Now, This is really a concern because the Israelites, during this time period of the Maccabean revolt and what follow, they end up having their own internal rivalries between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which follows the rivalries between the Tobiads and the Nazarites. And those rivalries involve any number of diplomatic maneuvers with the Romans and with the Parthians to the east, who are the successors to the Persians, in order to garnish support to prop their own power up. Jesus doesn't want any of this factionalism. He doesn't want any of these rivalries going on. Again, his goal is to make sure that you uphold the greatest commandment, to make sure everyone's treating each other with respect. So I think that's a solid introduction. Shogun, did you want to say something there?
Well, I'm not sure. So you're saying that Jesus wanted church unity. He didn't want church division based on like irrelevant divisions, and his intention was that everyone should be unified. So when you tie it into common sense, right? Like, what is your definition of common sense that like applies to Christianity?
So, like I said in the beginning, common sense, sensus communis is the connection of those three ideas of koinesthesis, koinous, and koinonia. It's the idea that regardless of sensation, you have a sensibility at stake. Regardless of who exists, we all have certain faculties. And regardless of who has those faculties, we all have certain ideas. So all the same, when it applies to Christianity, it's a realization that we all have this ability to learn from experience about God's creation. We all have a potential for our pious practice of grace, and we all have a capability to achieve salvation when it comes to our pious grace.
So we all have an opportunity to achieve salvation through grace. Grace is God's gift without condition. And so everyone can avail themselves of that regardless of any other condition.
Right. And when Abrahamic tradition is introduced to the Greeks in the 4th century, before the Maccabean revolt, that happens, in the mid 2nd century BC, it seems clear that they understood this as well. They just didn't really think of it in Abrahamic context or concepts. What they did instead was they used their own language of words like akrasia and apatheia and ataraxia. So, which one should we talk about first? We can talk about, we'll talk about apatheia first. So, apatheia is the idea that you don't want to be. A lot of people confuse apatheia with apathy, and it is important not to recognize it as simply being lazy. It's about realizing that you're going to have certain passions, but you don't want to become absorbed by those passions, because as much as you have certain passions, your passions are not the only ones out there. In Christianity, we would connect this to the idea of calling, and we don't want our callings to lead to temptation. When we become self-absorbed with our own talents, we start to ignore the talents of others, and that does lead to division, that does lead to factionalism, that does lead to rivalry. If anything, we see this happen a lot when it comes to people establishing which of the gifts or fruits of the Holy Spirit are the best. And it's like, well, wait a minute, none of them are the best. They all matter. So, as much as you might be passionate about this gift or this fruit, you have to have consideration towards the other ones.
Right.
Then you give me a second here. Okay, and then you have the notion of ataraxia. Ataraxia is the one that talks about how you don't want to be worrying about things that become your personal center of attention. So this is kind of like apatheia, but it's more that you don't want to be fussy or fickle or petty or pedantic. It's a matter of, okay, you have a little part of the world and there is something that you want to have achieved. However, that doesn't mean that the entirety of the world revolves around what you want to have achieved. So you realize how what you want is just a little part of the big picture. And as a consequence, you develop a sense of impressiveness about the big picture. And then the last one we have akrasia. That one is an understanding of how you don't always want to act in your own best judgment. So, what is efficient for yourself is not automatically efficient for everyone. And there comes a point in your life where you have to hit the brakes, where you have to just coast, and you have to realize, okay, yes, this matters in order to maximize my own best interest, but what about the consideration towards other people's best interest? And what's interesting about this is Aristotle actually writes about this a lot in Nicomachean Ethics, even before Abrahamic tradition is exposed to the Greeks themselves. So it seems pretty clear that, this idea of the greatest commandment that Jesus wanted to have established in the way that you're supposed to love others as you love yourself. It's something the Greeks are already on board with. So, yeah, I mean, to me, these two ideas, the idea of Christianity and the idea of, Greek Aquinas thesis and the rest of sensus communis, it seems to just automatically go hand in hand. And I think it's a little bit of a shame that a lot of people, what they've done is they've twisted these Greek concepts. They've treated them like, okay, common sense is no longer a matter of appreciating what everyone has in common, but it's simply a matter of taking the easy or the simple way out of understanding things. And I understand where this comes from, and I don't really like it. A lot of it happens because of Calvin's frustration against the Spanish, which leads to the Dutch revolting against the Spanish. So Calvin was frustrated from how divine right of kings was being manipulated in the Spanish Inquisition, because he knew about however many atrocities that were being committed under Tomás de Torquemada. And unfortunately, because of the time period, it wasn't really clear that the atrocities were being communicated on a prompt basis. It wasn't until Torquemada's successor came to power that the Pope finally caught wind of what was going on, and he had his successor removed. But what's really strange about Torquemada's appointment to the Grand Inquisitor position is the protocol was the King and Queen of Spain were supposed to nominate inquisitors, and then the Pope was supposed to confirm them. So Torquemada was nominated to a regular inquisitor position, and the Pope confirmed that. But then he was nominated to the Grand Inquisitor position, and there don't seem to be any documents that show that the Pope ever confirmed him to the Grand Inquisitor position. This is a really important role, and while there are a lot of history books that will say he was confirmed, they never actually cite a specific document. So this has always been a point of contention in history as to whether the Pope ever actually confirmed Torquemada to the position of authority that he would have needed. But in any case, Calvin takes this as an excuse to show why divine right of kings fails, and he wants to replace it with popular sovereignty. And this is where common sense gets skewed. Common sense no longer retains its original value that the Greeks assigned in saying it's something that applies to people in general, but rather Calvin starts to say it's what many people want specifically. So if you have an abundance of people and a lot of people find some sensation common, or if they find some conclusion with that sensation to be common, then they're allowed to run with it. This is not what Aristotle wanted in the first place, because he knew that you do not necessarily know in advance how sensations ought to be applied. He knew that, he writes about this in Nicomachean Ethics all the time when he's talking about the sophists and how they have some end and how they are using that end and they're propagating their ends. And he's concerned that they're not engaging in true philosophy, because life is not ever something that has a specific end. It is something that is ongoing, which is something that we're supposed to appreciate as Christians, the value of how time is ongoing. God is beyond time. Our own lives are mortal. Our own lives are finite. If we jump to some sort of finite conclusion, then we aren't really having consideration towards that which applies in general when it comes to the appreciation of grace. We're assuming that what we want is graceful. And when we do that, we start to lose our sense of discernment between calling and temptation. We start to see what we want to see rather than seeing what we ought to see. So what's happened, unfortunately, in a lot of people's modern appreciation of common sense is they're simply saying, oh, if a lot of people want to see something, then that is what we ought to see. But that is not what Aristotle wanted. It's not what Jesus said. So, I really think that maybe a lot of the reason why a lot of people hate common sense is because of that perversion of the idea. A lot of people say things like, oh, common sense isn't all that common. And in this regard, that makes a lot of sense. Some people might like the color blue, other people like the color green. Some people might like triangles, other people like squares. Some people might like hamburgers, other people like hot dogs. Some people might like pickup trucks, other people might like sport cars, right? And just because a lot of people like the color blue doesn't mean a lot of people also like pickup trucks. You have multiple dimensions of what people find common and what they like in life. So, society needs to understand that which is popular in some situations is not popular in all situations. So that's why people say common sense isn't all that common. But again, that's not what Aristotle originally meant by the idea. He wasn't trying to say that which is popular is that which is common. He was saying there are certain aspects of the human experience which applies regardless of the experience at stake. And, all the same in Christianity, when we're learning about God's creations, we have to understand that just because a lot of people learn something doesn't mean everyone learns something. And if anything, it's our appreciation of those who are learning unusual aspects of life who end up revealing something in general. This concept of revelation that we have a lot in piety and grace and faith, we have to understand that there is a difference between us as individuals finding something inspirational versus us finding something inspirational when living in common with others. A lot of people get these concepts of special and general revelation confused. And as a consequence, they start to say, oh, you're obviously not saved because you don't see my sort of revelation. Well, wait a minute. I mean, you have to recognize we are not gods. We are all creations and we are all acting as stewards. So we shouldn't be condemning each other's stewardship just because each other's stewardship is not what we expect it to be. Sometimes things happen in unusual ways, and we all know that. God works in unusual ways. So, Shogun, did you want to say something?
Well, you've said a lot, and I appreciate it, and I'll have to reflect on it. But basically, I think what your thesis is that common sense and Christianity are actually one and the same and not at variance with each other.
Right.
And that Christian values and ethics already correlated with existing values and ethics systems and just sort of reasserted them and reaffirmed them. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're completely in touch with one another. And we just need to appreciate what was really being said when common sense was originated back around the 4th century BC. We need to make sure that we're not jumping to conclusions like it's been twisted into today.
Right. So thank you very much for that. Should we ask, does anyone in the audience have a question who listened to the podcast? Does anyone have a question or comment? If not, MJP, is there sort of like a summary or a takeaway that you'd like people to take from what you said today?
There are some articles I'm gonna give you that we can link with the recording that when we put it on YouTube. I think these will really touch on the interactions between the Greeks and the Israelites, because a lot of people find there to be a lot of rivalry between the Greeks and the Israelites. It's pretty well documented that the Jews were not in favor of being Hellenized, and a lot of people, when they read about the Maccabean revolt, whether they're in Sunday school or they're doing Bible study, I actually think a lot of people come away with the wrong impression. A lot of people think that the Israelites were opposing Greek imperialism and that, Jonathan Maccabees and his family, they died a bunch of martyrs in order to stand up for the tradition of Judeo-Christian tradition. But what I think a lot of people don't understand is that the Greeks, because of the fact that they had already received Abrahamic tradition in the 4th century, were really trying to restore the Hebrew ideas back unto them. Because you have to remember, the Jews had gone through the Babylonian and the Assyrian exiles going back to the 8th century BC, the 6th century BC, and they were just recently returning to Judea at the time. It's not clear that they had everything intact. It's not clear that they remembered everything correctly. And again, the rivalries that they were having among their own factions were making things difficult for them to compile that which was really canon and that which was really faithful. We might do another podcast about this sometime, dealing with the rivalries, and I really don't mind digging into that, because that is a very dramatic time period in history. There's a lot of characters to be discussed who engage in any number of plots in order to jockey for status, and this is what leads to Herod the Great. And we all know about the tyranny of Herod the Great. We know about how he had his own sons executed, and we know about the massacre of the innocents that is attempted in order to prevent Jesus from coming about. So that there's a lot of drama to be ironed out there. But for what we're talking about now, I think if I just give you the links, everything should be good.
Well, I really thank you for sharing your perspective and your knowledge about this. I think we can definitely make it into a series and go deeper into it, and we'll make sure to attach the links to the YouTube and BitChute uploads when they go up. Seth, were you wanting to say something?
I loved it, dude. Yeah, this was a great series, dude, for sure. I'm just intrigued by the whole subject at hand. You know, this is a great subject.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, MJP. This will be short and sweet, and it can be the first episode of a new series, and we'll get it uploaded as soon as we can. So, was there any final takeaway statement you want to make?
I think I've said everything that needs to be said.
I agree. So thank you so much, MJP, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Make sure you join the Temple Mount Discord server, and make sure you follow and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Temple Mount Official, and you can find us on BitChute as well. We got lots of great episodes there for you to check out, and check back with us tomorrow at 7 p.m. We'll have another podcast for your entertainment. Thank you, MJP. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to banish the Craigbot, and then we can join the Templar Tavern for the rest of the night. So that was awesome. Thank you. Yeah. It always takes me a minute to banish the Craigbot. There we go.